In a time when simple kindness often goes unnoticed, one quiet act of compassion would cost Emma the job she so desperately needed and lead her toward a future she never imagined. Late on a cool evening in the bustling heart of the city, Emma stepped out from behind the restaurant's polished counter. She paused for a moment, remembering how her grandmother always said that true hospitality wasn't about fancy linens or lofty prices, but about treating every person with warmth and respect. The elegant surroundings and well-to-do clientele never dazzled Emma as much as the simple satisfaction of offering someone a friendly smile. Yet that very night, her belief in doing right by others would set in motion a series of events that would forever change her life. Before we begin, let us know where you are watching from. Or a simple "thank you" in the comments means the world to us. Emma's shift was nearly at its end, and she could already feel the fatigue settling in. Polished glassware sparkled under soft lighting, and the gentle hum of a conversation reminded her of summer gatherings on her parents' porch, where laughter and good company were worth more than any 5-star rating. She smoothed out the crease in her apron, collecting her thoughts before heading to clear a table. Just then, the front door swung open, letting in a crisp swirl of cool air. In stepped a man dressed in faded jeans, a modest black hoodie, and a cap pulled low over his brow. At first, Emma thought perhaps he had wandered in by accident, maybe a traveler looking for a quick meal. But something about his quiet, polite nod as he took a seat in the corner felt unexpectedly familiar. She hesitated for a moment, sensing he might prefer privacy. Yet, as the head waiter approached him with visible unease, Emma noticed the man was meeting only cold stares from the staff. Deep down, she remembered her grandmother's words. You should never judge a person by their appearance. Taking a breath, Emma resolved to do what felt right, regardless of who might disapprove. Emma glanced around the restaurant, noticing how many eyes were darting toward the man in the corner booth. Of course, the regular clientele here were used to high society, glossy attire, sparkling jewelry, but they weren't used to someone dressed so modestly. The head waiter, a tall man named Colin who prided himself on maintaining a particular image, seemed hesitant, almost unnerved by the newcomer's casual appearance. Emma stepped forward, gently pressing her palm against the folded menu she was carrying, mustering the courage to do what felt right. "Excuse me," she said softly, edging past Colin. "Let me take care of this table." He opened his mouth to protest, but Emma's composed expression and steady tone made him pause. Colin shrugged as though to say, "Fine, but it's on you." She headed to the corner, her breath hitching slightly when she finally took in the man's face. It was Keanu Reeves, the same beloved actor she had seen in countless films. There was no question about it. She recognized his kind eyes and gentle demeanor, even if he wore a simple black hoodie and kept his cap low. Up close, he seemed even more polite. He tipped his head in greeting, then offered a warm, faint smile. "I'm sorry," he said, voice low enough that others around them wouldn't overhear. "I didn't realize you needed a reservation here. I can leave if it's a problem." Emma remembered how, as a child, her father would often remind her that everyone deserves respect. "It's no problem at all, sir," she replied, fighting the swirl of nerves in her stomach. "I'd be happy to get you something to eat." Before she could say another word, an echo of hard-soled shoes rang out against the restaurant's gleaming floor. Turning, Emma saw Mr. Daniels, the manager, hurrying over. He was a stocky man in his mid-50s, always impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that seemed to reflect his own inflated sense of importance. His clipped tone and narrowed eyes told Emma everything she needed to know. He wasn't here to be pleasant. "Is there an issue, Emma?" he asked, though the question sounded more like a reprimand. Emma drew in a breath. "No, Mr. Daniels," she said with calm politeness. "I was just about to take this customer's order." Mr. Daniels stiffened and his features hardened. He turned his attention to Keanu, scanning the man from head to toe as though searching for a reason to dismiss him. "I'm afraid this table is reserved," he said, a thin, artificial smile creeping onto his face. We have a strict policy. We don't serve walk-ins." Keanu began to stand, his expression gracious even in the face of rudeness. "If it's that big of a trouble, I can just find somewhere else to—" Emma felt a sudden heat rise within her. She recalled her grandmother telling her about a time when folks would help one another without a second thought, especially if they noticed a traveler in need of a meal. A restaurant might have signaled a closed sign, but if someone was genuinely hungry, they'd still be invited in. Those days seemed far away in this polished, modern setting, yet the principle remained in Emma's heart. "He's not causing any trouble," she said, steadying her voice. "If you don't mind, I'll prepare his meal to go. Or we could at least offer him a seat until he decides what he'd like. It's nearly closing, anyway." Mr. Daniels flung a sharp look her way, one that told her she was stepping well beyond her bounds. "Emma," he warned, "I think you're forgetting your place." A hush fell around them. Though the restaurant was still dotted with a handful of patrons finishing their meals, they were no longer chatting animatedly or enjoying dessert. Many had turned to watch this scene unfold. Emma felt the weight of that attention bearing down, but she couldn't bring herself to back down. Something about the manager's dismissive attitude reminded her of every time in her life she had seen someone mistreated, every time someone was told they didn't belong. "Actually," Emma responded, her voice gaining an unexpected resolve, "I remember my place quite well. I'm a server, and I serve people who want a meal." Mr. Daniels' cheeks turned a shade of crimson. "That's enough," he said, raising his hand in a silencing gesture. He glanced around at the onlookers, forcing a thin-lipped managerial grin. "We're a fine establishment. We don't accept just anyone." Keanu cleared his throat softly. "I don't want to inconvenience you. I'm sorry if I misunderstood the reservation policy." Emma cut in, shaking her head. "You're not an inconvenience." At that, Mr. Daniels threw up his hands. "That's it, Emma. You can hand me your apron. You're done." The finality in his voice slammed into her like a cold gust of wind. She blinked, momentarily stunned. He wanted her gone, fired, over such a small act of courtesy? The words lodged in her throat, but anger and heartbreak mingled in her chest. Slowly, she reached down and untied the familiar black apron she had been wearing for the past 2 years. She set it on a nearby table, the crisp cotton edges folded neatly. The motion felt surreal, as though she were watching someone else's life fall apart. Without another word, she pivoted on her heel and walked away, head held high despite the tremor in her hands. When she reached the front door, she turned back briefly to glimpse Keanu Reeves standing by the table looking after her with a sympathetic frown. For a moment, his eyes seemed to say, "I'm sorry." Emma managed a small nod before stepping out into the cool evening air. Her heart pounded as she hurried down the sidewalk, the city lights flickering overhead. In the distance, she could hear the muffled sounds of traffic and saw the glow of high-rise apartments. Part of her couldn't believe it had all happened so fast. She had just lost her job, her only source of income, for doing what she felt was right. Yet, as she walked, she couldn't quite muster regret. Disbelief and anxiety, yes. Regret, no. After all, there was no question that the manager's behavior had been unfair. She pressed a hand over her eyes, trying to push back the worry that threatened to choke her. Rent was due in barely a week, and she had little savings. It felt as though the walls of her life were closing in. Emma's apartment was a modest studio in a worn-down building. The walls were thin, and the street noise filtered in. She could hear a dog barking somewhere, then the shuffle of someone climbing the narrow stairwell. Once inside, she tossed her keys onto a chipped kitchen counter and slumped into the lone chair by the window. Normally, after a long shift, she liked to brew a cup of chamomile tea, a habit she'd picked up from her mother. Tonight, her hands shook too much to hold the kettle steady. She found her phone in her bag, noticing a missed text from her closest friend, Mia. "Heard what happened. Are you all right? Call me." Emma typed back with trembling fingers. "Just got home, got fired for trying to serve the wrong person at the wrong table. Exhausted. not okay. Almost immediately, 3 dots signaled Mia was responding. Wait, you mean Keanu Reeves? That's wild. People online are talking about it. Emma frowned. Online? She rarely engaged with social media beyond checking local news or following a handful of home cooking groups. The idea that her confrontation with Mr. Daniels was talked about at all, much less by strangers, felt jarring. But her phone battery was nearly dead. She plugged it into the wall and sank onto her bed, willing the tangle of thoughts in her mind to settle. Yet sleep refused to come. She lay awake, counting the lines in the ceiling's dim light. Behind her closed eyes, she kept replaying the moment Mr. Daniels turned on her. How easily he had tossed aside 2 years of service. She thought about her precarious financial situation. Worst of all, she felt a creeping uncertainty. Maybe she should have stayed silent. Maybe she should have let him throw Keanu out. Would keeping her job have been worth a quiet conscience? Eventually, exhaustion won out. Emma drifted into fitful rest, her last conscious recollection the memory of Keanu's considerate smile, an oddly comforting image in a harsh day. The next morning, Emma woke to find a barrage of notifications on her phone. She rubbed the sleep from her eyes and glanced at the screen. Mia had sent multiple messages, each more breathless than the last. Emma, check social media. There's a picture of you talking to Keanu. Someone snapped it. It's all over Facebook and Twitter. People are furious at the restaurant. With a pounding heart, Emma tapped one link after another. She found a post by a customer who'd been dining that night. The post included a blurry photo of Emma standing between Keanu and Mr. Daniels, her expression tense but resolute. The caption read, "Witness this server get fired for showing kindness. Manager was rude to Keanu Reeves, told him to leave for not having a reservation. She stood up for him, and next thing we know she's out of a job. Horrible treatment by the restaurant." Thousands, no, tens of thousands of people had reacted or shared it. The comments were a blur. That manager should be ashamed. Boycott the restaurant until they rehire her. Keanu is known for being humble. Good on her for standing up. Emma's hands shook. Her story had turned into a public outcry overnight. And then she noticed a major entertainment site had even picked it up, headlining an article. Waitress fired for helping Keanu Reeves in upscale restaurant showdown. She felt equal parts astonishment and alarm. She never wanted that kind of spotlight. Yet a small flutter of hope sparked within her too. If enough people supported her, maybe she'd find a new job sooner rather than later. Her phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. The caller ID showed an unknown number. She hesitated, heart thrumming. On any normal day, she might have let it go to voicemail, but something compelled her to answer. "Hello," she said cautiously. A soft, measured voice responded. "Emma, this is Keanu." She nearly dropped the phone. Her voice snagged in her throat. "Hello," she repeated, trying to sound composed. "I wanted to see how you're holding up," he said, his tone gentle. "I feel bad about what happened. You were only trying to do your job." Emma felt a wave of relief wash over her, simply knowing someone understood, that she hadn't been crazy or rebellious for no reason. "I'm managing," she said. Then, with a rush of honesty, she added, "Honestly, I'm worried about making rent next week, but I don't regret what I did." "You shouldn't," Keanu said quietly, "and you're not alone in this. I made a statement last night because I wanted people to realize it's not about celebrity or special treatment. It's about treating each other with basic decency." Emma glimpsed another text message coming in, but she stayed focused on the call. "Thank you," she whispered, blinking back tears. "I appreciate that you spoke up." There was a pause on the line, then Keanu continued, "I have an idea, if you're open to it. I'd like to meet tomorrow. There's a project I'm involved in, and someone like you, someone principled, could really help." "A project?" she echoed, swallowing dryly. It sounded so vague, yet everything about the past day had been surreal. "Yes," she said finally. "I'm open to it." "Great," he replied. "I'll send a driver around in the morning, if that's all right. Around 9?" Emma glanced at the old clock hanging on her wall. Her mind raced with questions, but none of them formed coherent sentences. 9 is perfect, she managed. Then it's settled. There was a sincerity in his tone that made her believe, for the first time since yesterday, that things might turn around. "Get some rest, Emma. You deserve it." When he hung up, Emma sat with the phone pressed to her ear for a long moment, as if waiting for reality to catch up. Then she slowly set it aside, exhaling shakily. She scrolled through the new messages from Mia, each one bursting with excitement. "Keanu gave an interview about you. Said you shouldn't have been fired." "People are outraged at the restaurant. They're giving it terrible reviews." "The restaurant might have to close if this keeps up." Emma felt her heart twist. She never meant to ruin anyone's livelihood. There were other waiters and staff there who needed their jobs, just as she had. But it wasn't her doing. It was Mr. Daniels' cruel dismissal that had started this entire uproar. She only hoped that if the restaurant did face consequences, the blame would fall on the manager, not the other employees. The next morning, Emma awoke well before her alarm, nerves fluttering in her stomach. By 8:30, she was dressed in her nicest pair of slacks and a simple blouse. She ran a hand through her hair, wishing she had something more professional to wear. She remembered the many times older relatives had told her, "Dress for the job you want, not just the one you have." But her resources were limited. With a final glance in the mirror, she decided neat and sincere would have to be enough. At precisely 9, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb outside her building. Emma's neighborhood was mostly made up of aging apartment blocks and small family stores. The contrast between the shiny car and the battered concrete was hard to miss. She stepped outside, pulling her coat tight against the chilly morning air. A driver in a crisp suit greeted her with a polite nod. "Miss Emma?" he asked. She nodded, barely managing a small smile. He opened the door for her. Inside, the car smelled of clean leather and a faint trace of cologne. As they pulled away, Emma stared out the window at the passing streets, still half expecting this to be a dream. Should she pinch herself to make sure she wasn't imagining it all? They drove for about 20 minutes, eventually stopping in front of a tall glass and steel building in the more modern part of the city. Sunlight reflected off the building's sleek exterior, making it glitter as though it were carved from ice. The driver helped Emma out, then guided her through the massive revolving doors. Inside, the lobby boasted marble floors, high ceilings, and large indoor planters filled with leafy green plants. A security desk to one side checked her name, then a friendly attendant directed her to the elevator. Emma's heart pounded as she rode to the top floor. She couldn't recall ever being in such a grand office. When the elevator doors slid open, Keanu was there, leaning against a glass reception counter. He greeted her with the same gentle smile she remembered from the restaurant. Only now, he seemed more at ease, dressed in a neat blazer and dark jeans. "Morning," he said, extending a hand. "Glad you made it." Emma returned the handshake, noticing how everyone in the office was discreetly watching them, clearly curious. "Thanks for inviting me," she managed. "Come on." He led her down a hallway lined with abstract paintings and potted plants that must have come from some high-end florist. They entered a spacious conference room where a few people were already seated, individuals who looked focused, professional, yet surprisingly warm in their demeanor. Keanu gestured for Emma to take a seat next to him. A woman with silver hair and a soft smile introduced herself as Margaret. "I help organize philanthropic efforts," Margaret explained. "We partner with organizations that tackle social issues. Workplace injustice is one area we're passionate about." Emma blinked, mind swirling with questions. Keanu cleared his throat to gather the room's attention. "Everyone, this is Emma," he began. "She's the person we've all heard about in the news. unjustly fired for showing kindness. He glanced at her, eyes compassionate. I was able to see firsthand her integrity and willingness to stand up for what's right. She felt her cheeks warm under the praise, but she clung to her composure. I just did what anyone else would have, she murmured. Well, Margaret said gently, you'd be surprised how many people don't. Keanu nodded in agreement. I've been a part of philanthropic work for years, supporting arts, children's hospitals, and more. Lately, I've wanted to focus on helping people who, like you, find themselves mistreated or powerless in their workplaces. He leaned forward, folding his hands on the polished table. Emma, I'd like you to join us in an official capacity. You have the empathy, and you've been on the receiving end of workplace unfairness. That perspective is invaluable. Emma glanced around, unsure of what to say. The men and women at the table were looking at her with encouraging expressions, not judgment. She remembered standing in that frigid night air after losing her job, feeling hopeless. Now, she was in a high-rise office being offered a chance to help others who faced the same struggles she had. It was more than she ever dreamed possible. Her mind buzzed with uncertainty. Could she really do this? She had no background in charity work beyond volunteer soup kitchens or church drives. Yet maybe that was exactly why her voice mattered. I'm honored, she said softly. But I'll need some guidance. I've never done anything like this before. A man in a crisp navy suit, his name tag read Andres, smiled reassuringly. We'll show you the ropes. We collaborate with legal teams, career counselors, and worker advocacy groups. You won't be alone. Keanu's expression brightened. We'll start small. Think about what causes or missions speak most to you. Maybe it's helping restaurant staff who've been unfairly dismissed, or advocating for workers' rights in similar industries. You can speak from experience. That's powerful. Emma paused, recalling the sinking feeling of being fired without warning or compassion. She thought of colleagues who had also struggled under harsh managers or faced shifts cut without notice. At last, she exhaled, a tentative but genuine smile edging across her face. Then let's do it. Things seemed to move at lightning speed after that. Margaret introduced Emma to the group more formally, discussing the immediate tasks, screening potential cases of workplace abuse, offering small grants to employees who needed legal support, and collaborating with existing nonprofits to raise awareness. The meeting ended on an upbeat note. Everyone shared the sense of excitement that Emma's public story had spurred. But just as she stepped out of the conference room, Emma felt her phone vibrate. The number displayed on the screen was unfamiliar. She almost ignored it, but curiosity or habit made her answer. "Hello?" she said, pressing the phone to her ear as she walked toward the lobby. Silence greeted her for a beat. Then a low, unmistakably hostile voice spoke up. "Emma," the caller said, "you think you've made a big splash, don't you? I heard you got people stirred up online." Her heart skipped. "Who is this?" she asked, fighting to keep her voice from shaking. A chuckle drifted through the line, hollow and mocking. "You better watch your step, young lady. Some of us have powerful connections, and we don't appreciate troublemakers. You should have stayed quiet about what happened in that restaurant." Emma's stomach twisted. She thought immediately of Mr. Daniels, the manager who had fired her. He had always carried himself as though he had connections. Was it him? Or maybe one of his associates? She swallowed, trying to maintain composure. "I'm sorry you feel that way," she forced out, not knowing how else to respond. The voice turned colder. "You think the world's on your side because you got your story in the papers, but that can change real quick. Keep your nose out of things that don't concern you. Understand?" A surge of anxiety ran down her spine. She was about to ask for a name or retort with a sharp comment when the line clicked dead. The abrupt silence rattled her. She stared at her phone, heart pounding. Behind her, Keanu had followed her out. He seemed to sense her distress immediately. "Emma, is something wrong?" he asked, placing a hand lightly on her shoulder. She turned, swallowing hard, and whispered, "I think that was Mr. Daniels, or someone close to him, threatening me, telling me to back off." Keanu's brow furrowed. "Come on," he said. "Let's talk to Margaret and the team. We'll handle this." And so Emma found herself back in the conference room, sharing the unsettling phone call. Margaret and Andres exchanged worried looks. Keanu stood by Emma's side, a protective set to his jaw. It dawned on Emma that these people weren't just offering her a job, they were also prepared to support and defend her from the kind of intimidation that unscrupulous bosses often use to silence employees. "This confirms what we suspected," Andres murmured. "Some managers will do anything to keep negative press at bay or to stop employees from standing up for their rights. But the fact that they're trying to scare Emma suggests they're feeling cornered." Keanu nodded. "We can trace that call, or at least figure out how serious the threat is. We might want to inform the authorities if it continues." Emma realized how quickly her life had pivoted from quiet anonymity to a cause célèbre, targeted by people who wanted to protect their own interests. The swirl of it all made her head spin. Margaret's voice was calm and reassuring. "Emma, you don't have to face this alone. We'll reach out to our contacts who specialize in workers' rights cases. As for the restaurant, let's see if the owners take action against Mr. Daniels." Emma exhaled slowly. It felt surreal to be in a position where she needed a protective circle. Yet it also reminded her that sometimes standing for what's right means stepping into the crosshairs of those who benefit from wrongdoing. Over the next few days, Emma dove into her new role. Though she was still learning the ropes, she spent hours sitting with the team, poring over stories from people who had written in via email or social media. Some were single parents fired without cause, others were older employees let go just before retirement so companies could avoid paying pensions. It was heartbreaking to realize how common these injustices were. Emma's main task was sifting through the incoming messages, identifying which cases seemed legitimate and urgent. She would flag them for the legal partners who could then investigate. In this role, her empathy served her well. Whenever she saw a story that mirrored her own, she made sure to highlight it, feeling a personal responsibility. Keanu checked in often. Though he had multiple projects and commitments, he always found a moment to drop by Emma's desk, a small corner cubicle that the team had set up for her. He'd ask how she was coping, listen to her frustrations, and encourage her to balance her newfound sense of mission with self-care. One afternoon, Emma pulled up a local news site out of curiosity. Sure enough, an article about the restaurant's backlash was front and center. The owners had been forced to make a statement, apologizing for Mr. Daniels' overzealous enforcement of policy. The statement went on to say they did not condone the firing of any employee for extending courtesy to a customer. Emma could hardly believe her eyes when she read that the owners had decided to part ways with Mr. Daniels, effective immediately. The manager who had so callously tossed Emma aside was himself out of a job. She felt a rush of relief, tinged with sadness. A part of her never wanted to cause someone else to lose their livelihood. But Mr. Daniels had made his choices. Mia, who continued to send exuberant texts, summed it up best. He reaped what he sowed. After reading the article twice, Emma leaned back in her chair, letting out a long breath. Justice, in some form, had arrived. She thought of the countless times she'd stayed late at the restaurant, cleaning tables, making sure everything was perfect for the next day, only to be treated like a disposable worker. Maybe now, the owners would understand the damage caused by unfairly dismissing people who actually cared about customers. The phone on her desk buzzed. She expected it to be Mia again, but the number displayed on the small screen was different. Gathering her courage, she picked up. "Hello?" An unfamiliar woman's voice. "Hello, Emma. You don't know me, but I just wanted to say thank you." Emma straightened. "Thank me for what?" "For speaking up for someone you didn't know. You helped Mr. Reeves, of course, but you also helped me. And many others, believe it or not." Emma tilted her head, glancing at her computer as though it would reveal who this person was. "I'm glad, but how exactly?" The woman introduced herself as a former employee of the restaurant who had also been mistreated by Mr. Daniels. "I could never prove it, and he always hid behind the owner's policies," she explained. "But after your story came out, people started talking, and they realized it wasn't an isolated incident. I just wanted you to know that you inspired me to finally speak up." Emma felt a rush of warmth in her chest, tears pricking the corners of her eyes. "I'm so happy you found the courage," she managed. "Thank you for telling me." They spoke a bit longer, and Emma promised to connect her with the organization's legal advisors. When the call ended, Emma sat there in a kind of reverie. The idea that her single act of defiance had opened the door for others to stand up was simultaneously humbling and empowering. She thought of how her grandparents often talked about the ripple effect, how a single stone dropped into water could create waves that spread far beyond what the eye could see. A couple of weeks passed, and the initial whirlwind of media attention began to settle. Life, however, was anything but stagnant for Emma. She spent her days working side by side with Margaret, Andres, and the others, reading testimonies, organizing outreach, and helping set up meetings with attorneys or local advocacy groups. Though it was challenging, it felt meaningful in a way that her restaurant job never had. One morning, Keanu stopped by her desk with 2 cups of coffee in hand. He set one down in front of her. "You've been working tirelessly," he said, a flicker of concern in his eyes. "Remember to pace yourself." Emma wrapped her hands around the paper cup. "I will," she promised, taking a sip and savoring the gentle warmth. "But I can't tell you how grateful I am for this opportunity. If you hadn't stepped in—" He shook his head before she could finish. "Don't give me too much credit," he said, sincerity coloring his tone. "You stood up for me, but you also stood up for what you believe in, at great personal cost. I was just lucky enough to notice." Emma felt her chest tighten, recalling how uncertain she'd been that night in the restaurant. She looked around the bustling office, a place teeming with purpose. "It's funny," she remarked, voice soft. "Losing my old job felt like the end of the world, but in hindsight, maybe it was the beginning." "You'd be amazed," Keanu said, "how often adversity can lead to a path we never saw coming." She thought back to older relatives who used to tell her that sometimes you lose a job to find your calling, or that closed doors can point you toward open windows. At the time, such sentiments always felt like vague platitudes. But now, she understood the truth behind them. The best parts of life often arrived unannounced, in the middle of struggle. In the weeks that followed, Emma couldn't entirely escape the hostility lingering from her old workplace situation. She continued to receive a handful of anonymous messages, some supportive, others laced with bitterness or outright insults. Most were from social media accounts that seemed fake or hidden behind initials. She saved them, cataloging the threatening ones in a special folder that Andres had recommended, just in case legal action was ever necessary. The intimidation wasn't enough to sway her, though. If anything, each cruel or spiteful message only reaffirmed the importance of what she was doing. She had the backing of her new organization and the unwavering support of people like Mia and Keanu, who made sure she was never isolated. One afternoon, as she was leaving the office for lunch, she spotted a familiar figure in the lobby, someone she never expected to see in this building. It was Mr. Daniels, wearing a less sharply tailored suit now, but with the same haughty tilt to his chin. He hadn't noticed her yet. He was talking to someone else by the reception desk, gesturing impatiently. Emma's heart kicked up a notch. The memory of his glare and the sting of his words still felt fresh. She considered turning back toward the elevator, avoiding the encounter altogether. But then she remembered how far she'd come, how she had found her voice and a community that believed in her. So she walked forward, her steps measured. Eventually, Mr. Daniels turned and locked eyes with her. For a fraction of a second, his expression betrayed surprise. Then his lips twisted into a sneer. "Well, if it isn't Emma," he said, voice dripping with sarcasm. "I suppose you think you've won. Emma drew in a slow breath. "I'm not here to fight you," she replied, keeping her tone calm. "But yes, I do feel like I'm in a better place now." He glanced around as if to ensure nobody important was within earshot. "That little publicity stunt of yours, getting me fired, how proud you must be." She stiffened at the accusation. "I didn't get you fired. You made your own choices, Mr. Daniels." He scoffed. "You let the world believe I was some tyrant. Guess what? You're not going to change anything. There will always be people like me in charge." Emma could feel tension radiating in her chest, but she remembered Margaret's advice. Anger alone wouldn't solve anything. "That might be," she conceded, "but for every person misusing their power, there are many more willing to stand up against it. You're seeing that now." Before he could retort, a security guard approached. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," the guard said, appearing none too pleased to see a confrontation in the lobby. Mr. Daniels snarled something under his breath and shot Emma one last look before hastening out. Emma let out a shaky breath. The guard nodded politely at her, then returned to his post. In that moment, she felt a surge of resolve. Mr. Daniels' words, meant to belittle her, only served as a reminder of why her work mattered. She wasn't trying to fix the entire world at once, but she was making a difference where she could, helping people who'd been silenced or mistreated by managers just like him. By the end of her 3rd month in the new role, Emma felt more confident than she ever had. She had assisted in organizing a small forum for local restaurant workers, connecting them with pro bono legal services. Attendance had been strong. Men and women from all walks of life stepped forward, sharing their experiences and seeking advice. During the forum, Emma manned a desk near the entrance, greeting attendees and guiding them to the right speakers. A few recognized her from the news coverage and thanked her for being a catalyst. She responded modestly, insisting she was just one piece of a larger community effort. But inside, she felt proud. The biggest surprise came near the end of the event when a middle-aged woman with worry lines etched across her face approached Emma. "You probably don't remember me," the woman said quietly, "but I was a hostess at your old restaurant. I was working the night you were fired." Emma straightened, searching her memory. It clicked. "I do remember you," she said gently. "Janet, right?" The woman nodded, her eyes glistening. "I just wanted to apologize. I saw how unfairly you were treated, but I didn't say anything. I was too scared of losing my job." A familiar knot tightened in Emma's stomach, recalling how lonely she had felt in that moment. She offered Janet a kind smile. "I understand, and there's nothing to apologize for. I'm glad you're here now." Janet exhaled shakily, relief flooding her features. "I left that place a month ago," she confessed, "and it felt like jumping off a cliff without a parachute. But after seeing how you stood up for yourself, I realized staying wasn't worth my dignity." Emma reached out and gently squeezed Janet's hand. "Good for you. I know it's not easy." They talked a while longer, exchanging stories about the restaurant's working conditions and the climate of fear Mr. Daniels had created. Janet was now seeking a healthier work environment. Emma promised to connect her with a friend who managed a more worker-friendly establishment. In that instant, Emma felt the heart of what she had become. A bridge, linking people to resources, offering moral support, and showing by example that a single voice, though small on its own, could resonate powerfully when combined with others. After the forum, Emma helped tidy up the chairs and tables, recalling how at her old job she would stay late to clean up but never feel particularly fulfilled. Tonight, even though her feet ached from standing for hours, she felt buoyed by a sense of accomplishment. People had shown bravery by coming to speak out or seek help, and she had played a part in making that happen. When she finally stepped outside, the sun was dipping low, casting a golden glow over the city skyline. To her surprise, Keanu was there, leaning against a nearby railing, a soft smile on his face. "Heard you did great in there," he said, gesturing toward the building. Emma gave a humble shrug. It was a team effort. He nodded, as if acknowledging she didn't want to take too much credit. "I'm proud of you," he said. "You turned a tough situation into a powerful platform. That's not easy." Heat rose to her cheeks, but she mustered a grin. "I guess it's just who I am. I never wanted the spotlight, but I also couldn't stand by while someone was treated unfairly." "And now you're helping others stand up, too," Keanu added. "That's the best part." She breathed in the crisp air, reflecting on how drastically her life had changed in such a short time. No longer was she the timid waitress worrying about rent. She was involved in advocacy, forging new connections and genuinely making a difference. That night, Emma returned to her modest apartment, now more comforting than ever before, and brewed a cup of chamomile tea. Sitting by the small window, she allowed herself a moment to simply be. The city lights twinkled, and in the distance she heard the rumble of a late bus. Her phone was silent. For once there were no urgent calls or messages. She smiled, remembering how the day had started with a swirl of nerves. She thought of her grandmother's old saying about how sometimes life reroutes you when you least expect it. You can go from falling behind to falling into place. She had lost a job but found a calling. She had faced threats but discovered true allies. Most importantly, she had learned that when you hold on to your integrity, no matter how small you feel, it can spark a ripple of change in others. Emma sipped her tea, gazing out at the stars overhead. Something in her heart told her this was just the beginning. Tomorrow she would get up, go to the office, and continue learning how to be an effective advocate. She would keep collecting stories, directing people to legal help, and participating in outreach programs. Maybe one day she'd spearhead her own charity or initiative. The future held countless possibilities. Where once she only dared to dream of stable paychecks and the hope of moving to a safer apartment, she now imagined a horizon far wider, where each step she took might uplift somebody else, lighting a spark of hope in a world often shadowed by injustice. She finished her tea, placed the mug on the windowsill, and let the quiet fulfillment of the day wash over her. In that serene moment, she realized that sometimes the hardest trials in life reveal strengths you never knew you possessed. And in defending a stranger, someone as unassuming and humble as Keanu Reeves, she had, in fact, rescued a part of herself. With that comforting thought, she prepared for bed, her mind at ease. Tomorrow would bring new stories, new struggles, and new victories. But for tonight, her soul rested on a single truth. Doing the right thing might cost you in the moment, but it can open doors you never believed were possible. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like it and share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness still exists in this world. Sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to stop, look closer, and make a difference.